The Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural Site typically hosts a once-a-month in-person speaker night series in our Buffalo, New York facility. We're excited to bring speaker night to a live online audience for the first time this evening. Many thanks to our sponsors, M&T Bank, as well as the New York State Council on the Arts for helping to make this series possible. We're joined tonight by Lauri Halderman, who will be helping us think more deeply about the statue of Theodore Roosevelt that stands on the front steps of New York City's American Museum of Natural History. Lauri is the Vice President for Exhibition at the American Museum of Natural History, where she leads the exhibition department in creating all of the museum's new traveling exhibitions, as well as developing many aspects of the permanent galleries currently under renovation. She's also the Chief of Content for the museum's new Gilder Center, slated to open in 2022. We're delighted to have her with us this evening, and without further ado, I will go ahead and turn things over to Lauri.
Thanks, Lenora, and especially thanks for inviting me to be part of the first remote Zoom speakers night. I'm really happy to have a chance to show all of you this project and to hear comments and questions at the end. Let me start by locating us. This is the American Museum of Natural History on the Upper West Side of New York City. We were founded in 1869, so we just had our 150th anniversary, and we are a natural and cultural history museum with close to 5 million visitors a year, at least before the shutdown. Some of the things people come to see at our museum, this life-size model of a blue whale is always a favorite. We have spectacular dioramas in many halls like these Alaskan bears. We have some dinosaurs. Oh, okay, we have a lot of dinosaurs. Some people believe that the dinosaurs and other exhibits maybe come alive at night. Who am I to say? Certainly Nite at the museum popularized that idea, as well as popularizing one of its stars. I have to imagine that many viewers had no idea why TR was in our museum. And in case any of you wonder too, here's a quick look at why Theodore Roosevelt has long been the museum's hero. This main building facing Central Park West is in fact the New York State Memorial to Theodore Roosevelt. Our association with TR actually begins with his father, who was one of our museum's original founders. Our 1869 museum charter was signed in the Roosevelt family living room, and we've had a Roosevelt on our board of trustees for most of our existence, including today. TR was, of course, a lifelong naturalist. He donated specimens to the museum as a child, and as president, he set aside 230 million acres of land as national forests, bird sanctuaries, national parks, and monuments. So when New York State wanted to create a memorial to him, to honor him after his death, it was not surprising that the museum was selected as the site to acknowledge him not as president, but as a naturalist and a writer of natural histories. Planning for the memorial began shortly after TR's death in 1919, and the building was dedicated in 1936, and the statue unveiled in 1939. Now, most of our visitors come in through this main front entrance to the museum and pass beneath this equestrian statue of TR with two unnamed figures, a native man on one side and an African man on the other. So here is the statue, and as people come up the front steps, they enter through the doors right behind it into the Roosevelt Rotunda. These wall murals have some of Roosevelt's presidential and other notable activities. On the floor below is an interpretive exhibition about Roosevelt. We renovated this hall in 2012 to focus on TR's legacy as the conservation president. We added this new bronze TR in his Robin Williams outdoor gear, much beloved by our visitors. And below it left, that's our museum president, in fact, with TR the Fourth. Also in this hall, there are cases of artifacts. On the left, some of the birds that TR taxidermied early in life and donated to our museum. We have 2 videos, we have dioramas. 3 of these are wildlife scenes, including this one of Roosevelt Ranch in the Dakota Badlands. Okay, the woman isn't usually in the scene, of course, but I really couldn't resist this shot. This photo was taken when we renovated the hall, and one of the updates was to add the pronghorn droppings, shall we say, to the scene to make it more realistic. The droppings were collected from a ranch in Montana and then freeze-dried. You really just can't make this stuff up. We have a very extensive interactive timeline in the gallery and also on the museum's website if you want to take a look. I'll post that website address at the end. There's a lot of information, all glowing, about our hero, TR, and his legacy of 20th century environmentalism. I'm telling you this so that you understand really how much the museum appreciates TR and calls attention to all he did for conservation. But in the 2010, 11, 12, at the time we were renovating this hall, we did wonder, though, what to do about the statue outside. Now, why would we wonder about the statue? Well, for decades, the statue had been something of a lightning rod. In 1971, as described here in the Times, so this is 50 years ago, 6 Native people were caught splashing buckets of paint on the statue and spray painting "Return Alcatraz" and "Fascist Killer" on the museum's wall. Now, neither TR nor AMNH had anything to do with the occupation of Alcatraz by Native peoples in 1971. But these young Native people were probably not the first to think that a white man on a horse above 2 people of color below just doesn't look right to everyone. Bad optics, let's say, at a minimum. There were other protests at the statue over the years as well, assuming that the statue was intended to express something positive, and we'll get into that a little later. What people were getting was seemingly something negative. So as we were renovating the memorial exhibition, we discussed maybe new signage to acknowledge that while the statue was intended to honor TR, it doesn't necessarily reflect the current values of the museum. We tried drafting statements for a plaque, but a plaque needs to be short. This is a sensitive issue. It wasn't easy to get that language just short and right. So in the end, we left the statue alone. And yet, just a handful of years later, all of that changed. So why? Why did we create an exhibition about this statue just a few years later? What changed? I'd say there were probably 3 main points. First, protests began to intensify, as seen here in 2016 on Columbus Day. A group called Decolonize This Place gathered a couple hundred people on the museum steps, draped the statue in black, and rallied around many issues. Needless to say, protesters upon a statue like this was not a reassuring moment for our security team. One focus of the protest was in fact a demand to remove the statue. And these protests have continued on subsequent years to lesser or greater degree, with continued demands to rename Columbus Day as Indigenous Peoples Day, remove the statue, and broadly respect the ancestors, an objection to cultural depictions in our museum and beyond. At another moment, another activist group calling itself the Monument Removal Brigade splashed the statue yet again with red paint. They said to a reporter, "Now the statue is bleeding. It's bloody at its very foundation. We have no intent to damage a mere statue. The true damage lies with patriarchy, white supremacy, settler colonialism embodied by the statue. It is these forms of oppression that must be damaged again and again until they are damaged out of existence." They also went on to talk about Roosevelt, the white supremacist and imperialist, they said. Second, the museum was in fact moving ahead with plans to renovate a major cultural hall. We had already completed 2 years of prototyping, and we're now starting a major renovation of this Hall of Northwest Coast Natives and First Nations peoples. We engaged Native experts as our partners and advisors, including a Native co-curator. So as part of this cultural reassessment of our own, we really knew we had to address the statue. I should note the museum does not own the statue. It's owned by the City of New York. So even if we wanted to take it down, it wasn't up to us. Part of our challenge then was simply figuring out how to address it beyond a simple plaque. By late 2016, we began a process in earnest of thinking about an exhibition on the statue, and we started to reach out to many different types of experts for conversations to inform our thinking. Meanwhile, and I'll try to do this just quickly, we addressed another problematic cultural depiction, which as it happens is in the TR Memorial Hall. It's this diorama, ostensibly depicting a 1660 encounter between New Amsterdam Governor Peter Stuyvesant, in the green sash at the left, and a group of native Lenape people led by Oratamen approaching from the right. It was intended to honor the Dutch ancestors of TR, although Peter Stuyvesant is not actually any relative. The scene depicted a very oversimplified moment of tribute, and many details about how the native people were depicted were wrong. Maybe the biggest problem was just the choice of scene at all, as though nearly naked native people bringing gifts to well-clothed Europeans somehow explain the complex issues of North American colonization. So working with an internal team and a smart young native advisor from Lenape community today, we took a kind of radical approach. We put our own commentary about the problems we had created with this scene right on the glass. Essentially, the 1660 encounter was intended to celebrate the Dutch founders of Old New York, but the scene offers only stereotypical representations and ignores how complex and violent colonization was for Native people. We added callouts to address specific details, other interpretive panels flanking the scene, including about the Lenape today, and a statement acknowledging the museum stood on Lenape territory, as is all of New York City. We noted this diorama was a small step, part of a larger initiative at the museum to reinterpret our cultural halls. Now, back to the statue. So third, the world began to change. There was a new national attention on offensive monuments, especially in the South, where there were and are many statues to Confederate leaders of the Civil War, mostly erected during the Jim Crow era. Some communities began to make plans to take down these statues. And in August 2017, as many of you may remember, in Charlottesville, Virginia, tensions really boiled over at the Unite the Right protest. Organizers said the goals were to unify the American white nationalist movement and to oppose removing a statue of Robert E. Lee. The resulting protests resulted in injuries and a death and drew national press. So back in New York, within a month, New York City's Mayor Bill de Blasio formed our own special commission to review public monuments in the city for symbols of hate and to determine which should be considered for removal. One under consideration was this seen here of Christopher Columbus, and another was the museum statue of Theodore Roosevelt. The commission was to elicit public opinion with questions meant to serve as guidance as to which monuments were seen as, quote, oppressive and inconsistent with the values of New York City. The commission was to announce its recommendations to the mayor. So our exhibition was already underway at this point, but we put it on hold to await the results. But when the commission issued its recommendations, there was really no consensus regarding the TR statue. Some commission members did vote to remove it, but others said they needed more information before they could decide. So the mayor issued his own statement. Reckoning with our collective histories is a complicated undertaking with no easy solution. Our approach will focus on adding detail and nuance to, instead of removing entirely, the representations of these histories. So the city would not remove the statue, but wanted new context. We got back to working on the exhibition. So who is the we who's doing this? Well, we had our internal creative team, our museum curator on the left, our fantastic outside filmmaker, Reniqua Allen, and a handful of museum staff with support from many others in the museum. But the creative group was actually much larger because we decided that the project would consist primarily of perspectives, many different perspectives, and not aligned. These were people we identified as having expertise, and we reached out to them to invite them to participate. Again, we were not trying to come to the answer. We were hoping that we would give visitors multiple perspectives, help them think about this issue for themselves. And we also talked to non-experts, all of these and more, who were often seeing the statue for the first time, to learn how just ordinary people on the street perceive it. We didn't want to understand the statue solely by hearing from experts, even diverse experts. So what we did, here's what we opened to the public in July 2019. We decided there would be 3 components to this new context: signage at the statue, an exhibition, and a video. And the museum's website would have its own TR statue section with the video and a digital version of the exhibition so that we would reach out beyond our own walls. The interpretation at the statue was very short and basic. It identifies TR as a US president and the 2 others as a Native American figure and an African figure. The key sentence was this: today, some see the statue as a heroic group, others as a symbol of racial hierarchy. We invited visitors to come inside to learn more, or we posted the URL for our website so that they could see the exhibition and the video from the street if they wanted. You'll see here, this is a floor plan that shows at the bottom where the statue is. You come straight through that rotunda that we saw with the murals, through African mammals, ironically passing an elephant that TR and Kermit shot, and you will reach our new exhibition, which, as you approach it, looks like this. And here is the exhibition. This is a complicated space with 4 different ways to enter and exit. The good news is it gets a lot of foot traffic. People who are just passing through on their way somewhere else actually do stop to look. Thanks very much to our graphics team for their bold colors and strong design. It's not easy to design this kind of exhibit successfully. We divided the exhibition into short sections: making of the statue, who else is depicted, more about Theodore Roosevelt, a section on multiple perspectives, and a quote. But in the time I have, I don't really want to try to walk you through the whole exhibition. Let's focus maybe on what we hope to achieve. As I said earlier, we really wanted to provide context for thinking about the statue in greater depth. And we focused on 4 questions. What did the original Planning Commission intend? What did the artists, and you'll notice that's plural, intend? How should we understand the statue today? And what should happen to the statue? So let's focus on those as our framework to take a quick look at the exhibition now. In the introduction, this is fairly brief with the date, the notion that it's meant to celebrate TR as a naturalist. It references his father as our founder. It notes specifically that the museum is proud of its association, its long association with the Roosevelt family. And it does say at the same time, the statue itself communicates a racial hierarchy that the museum and members of the public have long found disturbing. The voices of the exhibition are explicitly acknowledged in panel and in the video as well. In most museums, you don't really know whose voice or voices you are hearing. So this is an effort on our part to be more transparent. And I will say the best way to get the full effect of these multiple voices is actually to watch the video that we produced, which you see on the screen here. Because I really wish you could hear from all of these people as well as from me. But because it's 15 minutes long, I think you should take a look in your own time if you're interested. I'll post the URL at the end. All of these voices are also quoted in the exhibition, and I'll try to give you a sense of that as we take a look. So this section, called the making of the statue, has an introduction and 3 sections. You can see it a little more easily here: the commission, the architect, and the sculptor. So this is really where we address those first 2 questions, understanding the original intentions of the Roosevelt Commission and the artists. We'll start with the commission. It was formed in 1920 and headed by this man, Henry Fairfield Osborne, who had known TR since boyhood. Osborne, head of the commission, was also president of the American Museum of Natural History. Well, that was expedient. Do you wonder if Osborne's dual leadership roles influenced perhaps why the museum was selected as the memorial site? Our art historian's perspective on this, in a word, was yes. Now, mind you, the memorial consists of the entire building as well as the statue, murals, and TR exhibit. The trustees of the commission said, this memorial is intended to express Roosevelt's life as a nature lover, naturalist, explorer, and author of works of natural history. Fair enough. But a little more about Osborne. He was a prominent figure in the field of eugenics. a now thoroughly discredited idea of selective breeding of humans to eliminate certain traits or races and advance others. On Osborne's watch, the museum held 2 national conferences on eugenics. Now, we were hardly alone in promoting eugenics. State fairs promoted them, held contests to feature good families, universities were in on it, the Supreme Court decided cases influenced by eugenics. Still, it is not great that the head of the museum was an advocate of eugenics and also a powerful voice behind the creation of a statue depicting people of color. And an aside, we would also have to acknowledge that TR himself agreed with at least some aspects of eugenics. This is a letter from Theodore Roosevelt to Charles Davenport in 1913. Davenport was a biologist, a Harvard man, as was TR, and one of the leaders of the American eugenics movement. Selective breeding was the topic of the letter. And of course, as a keen naturalist and a rancher, TR would be both interested and would understand this. TR says, society has no business to permit degenerates to reproduce their kind. He likens it to farmers reproducing their stock and thinking stock that shouldn't breed, stock that should breed. He notes, someday we will realize that the prime duty, the inescapable duty of the good citizen of the right type is to leave his or her blood behind him in the world, and that we have no business to perpetuate citizens of the wrong type. It was a complicated time. White Americans feared an infertility crisis in their neighborhoods. TR warned that immigrants and minorities were too fertile. Anglo-Saxons risked committing what he called race suicide by using birth control and failing to keep up baby for baby. Later in 1916 came a book called The Passing of the Great Race, a work espousing eugenics, scientific racism, played an active role in crafting strong immigration restriction and anti-miscegenation laws in the United States. Grant promoted the idea of the Nordic race. He wanted to segregate unfavorable races in ghettos. Perhaps we can see where this is going. The Passing of the Great Race was lauded by Adolf Hitler, who in 1930s wrote a fan letter to Grant in which he called the book My Bible. Alas, TR also said a capital book in purpose and vision that all Americans should be sincerely grateful to you for writing it. So, what do we understand all of this as it relates to the statue? Well, nothing specific. And of course, TR had nothing to do with the statue itself. The commission and everything about the statue happened after his death. But I think we would have to understand more about the political climate, about powerful people like Osborne and Grant, who headed up these efforts, and even some of TR's own thoughts about other cultures. And of course, we know more about TR culture and race from his speeches and books like African Game Trails. Now, back to the origins of the statue. The commission selected the architect of the memorial, John Russell Pope, a prominent architect who also designed, seen here, the Jefferson Memorial, among other works. And so to our surprise in the museum, we discovered it was Pope who seemingly came up with the design of the statue. In the center of the terrace will arise a polished granite pedestal bearing an equestrian statue of Roosevelt with 2 accompanying figures on foot, one representing the American Indian and the other the primitive African. This heroic group will symbolize the fearless leadership, explorer, benefactor, and educator. Now, most of Pope's papers were destroyed in a flood, so we have to take the commission's words on this. This was quoted in a Memorial Commission write-up. Perspectives on this from our art historian Harriet Seney. She notes Pope refers to the figures as a heroic group. That's important. If in some criticisms the figures are to be taken as less than Roosevelt, that was never the intention. And yet Phil Deloria, a Harvard professor of Dakota descent, comments, you can see how these 2 figures have allegorical meanings relative to Roosevelt. They speak to Roosevelt as an American, as a person who happily goes as a dominating white figure to Africa, as a person who goes and takes advantage of the possibilities that arise by Indian land being dispossessed. Now, last in this trio is James Earl Frazier, prominent sculptor who designed many public monuments, including a bust of Roosevelt, this statue, End of the Trail, familiar to many, and the Buffalo Nickel. Some early sketches and maquettes from Frazier's archives. We researched all of this at the Frazier Archive at Syracuse University. They actually show TR alone, but others show 3 figures. And I think that maybe the lone TR was just Frazier working to get the pose right. So it looks as though by the time Frazier was on the job, the idea was already to have these 3 figures. On the other hand, this sketch is intriguing from his archives. It appears to show 3 walking figures with, I don't know, is that a winged horse? This would have solved a lot of problems for us, but it's unlabeled. Other than war, peace, science at its base, we don't really know how to interpret this. How should we understand the 2 people with TR? So here's what Frazier said. The 2 figures at Roosevelt's side are guides symbolizing the continents of Africa and America. And if you choose, they may stand for Roosevelt's friendliness to all races. So he says they're guides symbolizing friendliness. I don't doubt he thought that. But I think that all these powerful men would have looked at this design and thought, it looked right to them, like friendliness as they understood it. However, we all understand that today. We looked into the 2 figures, hoping we might find individuals they were modeled on, but they are seemingly both composites with details drawn from different individuals and groups. Frazier did the same thing when he designed the Buffalo nickel. I think he meant well, but today this sort of pastiche is not truly thought to be respectful, more of a stereotype. Maybe the inclusion of these 2 additional figures was just a question of size. Look at the arch that the statue needs to fill visually. It's going to take a very large statue. A statue of just TR on a horse, even a very large one, would never have been as controversial as the statue they created. And who knows, maybe Pope did imagine just a statue of TR on a horse, but it just wasn't going to be big enough. In the end, I don't think we'll ever know exactly how or why this design was selected. But I think we'd recognize that Osborne, Pope, Frazier, even TR, these were all white men of a certain education, class, social standing. I'm sure the statue did embody their ideals, and it certainly did make TR heroic, but at the expense of the other men. In the exhibit, we do try to honor these 2 other figures and present more about their cultures as best we can determine them, the Plains culture of the native man, the African man who bears some symbols of East Africa Maasai cultures. We present more about those cultures in TR's time and what life is like for them today. And then there's these latter 2 questions. How should we understand the statue today? And what should happen to it now? In this long wall, which we called multiple perspectives on TR, the statue, and what should happen, many people spoke to us about this and we organized their thoughts here. You'll see this in the long video as well. Maybe it's a little easier to see it this way. There we are. I should say the exhibition and the video were drawn from the same core set of interviews, but they use different pieces and are organized somewhat differently. Still, I think in the video, and I'm just going to grab a few still frames now, you get a vivid sense of what the statue says to people when they see it. Greg from Thailand. He wasn't sure, but he was willing to give it the benefit of the doubt. Could be seen as a friendship. Doug Brinkley, presidential historian. It's a beautifully rendered equestrian statue, but the symbolism of the statue is always problematic. A young girl named Devon, seen here with her mom, says at first she just noticed the horse and she thought, oh, a horse. But then when she looked at the statue more closely, she realized, oh, there's one person at the top and the other 2 at the bottom. Jerry, a visitor from Hawaii, said, it solidified what happened to some of my own ancestors. Monique, a professor and director of museum studies, says, it represents a racial hierarchy, and it pains me that that might be part of entering the museum. Alexandria, a visitor on our front steps, said, it hurts a lot of people, a lot of my people in particular, and minorities in general. So I think when we all look at the statue with our own eyes, whatever we might personally think, we have to listen when people say, it hurts me, it hurts my people, it hurts many people who are not the majority. We have to hear that. And now for the last question. So what do people think we should do Well, just like the commission, there is no consensus. You have our art historian, Harriet Seney, saying it's a good work of art and it's an integral part of the larger Roosevelt Memorial. You also have people who want to leave it up because they think it's a problem and we should keep the problem. We should see where America has been and where it could go. Others want to take it down. Nigel, a visitor, said, I don't know, make a new statue. Put a dinosaur there, a cheetah, a lion, something else. People who said, we should leave it up to provide people with a better understanding. We should use it as a teachable moment. Although, as Monique Scott says, why do Black people or people who experience racism have to accept everything as a teachable moment? And she's a professor. So I think we didn't try to tell people what to think. We just tried to show that it's complex and let people come to their own conclusions. As an end note, we included on our end wall this quotation from TR. It's about the importance of telling the truth. Truth about the president, the truth about everyone, and whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, difficult though it may be. We thought this was a good final note for TR's time, as well as for our own. Thank you so much. I'm happy now to hear your thoughts and your questions. I think some of you have probably already submitted them by text, and I am happy to do my best to answer them. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Lauri. I did actually see the exhibit myself, and that was actually what prompted me to reach out to you and ask you to be part of our speaker night. I thought it was really nice to see all of those perspectives, and I think it's important, certainly, that the museum is taking that step. We did have a couple questions, which I'll go over. If anybody has any other questions, feel free to go into the Q&A from the bottom, but we'll start with the ones we've already received. Lauri, we had somebody who was interested in knowing about the reaction to the reinterpretation of the diorama that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. That's actually been really rewarding for us. You know, I certainly the museum is interested both in what ordinary visitors think, in what teachers and students think, and also what the press thinks, what the larger public thinks. We had a very favorable article in the New York Times, and it was helpful for us to see because it generated almost 300 comments in the comments column. So we could take all of that in. That was fabulous. And as you might imagine, not everyone agreed, but a lot of people said, I think it's good that the museum is doing this, is taking this step. We did workshops with some teachers. Of course, we have a very active education department, and we do a lot of teacher training and education. They did it in a really interesting way, I thought. They showed the teachers a picture of the diorama as it had stood since the 30s, and not with our interpretation on the glass. And they asked them to talk out loud and to say what they thought the scene meant, what the scene was about, what they understood from the scene. And then they introduced the perspectives that we put on the glass, and they asked them now to reflect on that. And, you know, as museum people, we're always interested in doing what we call an evaluation. We really want to interview visitors as they're seeing our exhibits. It's hard work to do because sometimes people are busy, they have their families with them, they have a lot going on. So this kind of perspective that we understand from the teachers, some of whom said, oh, I see. I see that scene a little differently now. Certainly that's what we were hoping, that people would see it differently. The other thing is that it's not a usual thing to write on the glass. And some people now, I find, are just drawn to come and see what is this, because they can see that there's something written on the glass and it intrigues them and draws them over. So in that sense, I would say it's also good that we are getting more public attention just by virtue of doing the exhibit. We also had an interesting article that appeared in the Dutch press. There was a Dutch reporter in Brooklyn who thought the Dutch are very proud of their legacy in New York, and she thought maybe the Dutch would like to learn a little more about this and think about that themselves. And it was a lot of fun for me when my friend in Amsterdam pinged me the article and said, hey, you're in the Amsterdam press now. So it's exciting for us. We also heard from other people who were working on other kinds of problematic projects. A problematic mural in a school in San Francisco. People called me to say, do you think we could do something like this here? Problematic statues in Texas. Somebody came and visited and talked to me. It's interesting for us as practitioners to know that this idea might resonate beyond our own museum.
All right, thank you. You talked a little bit about this, but we also have a question about, can you elaborate on how the statue can be seen as a heroic group? I think, you know, what does that mean, I guess?
Right. Well, right. I think it's in the eye of the beholder. I mean, certainly if we took away the two figures and we saw TR on the horse, we would think of that as perhaps a heroic scene. I mean, after all, it's a kind of Rough Riders scene. It's very familiar. It's also an equestrian statue based on a 15th century equestrian statue from Italy. So this kind of trope of the man on the horse is well understood to us to be a leader. I think it's a good question, exactly. How, in what way do we see this as a heroic group? I have a hard time seeing it as a heroic group myself, but that is exactly what the commission said. So I'm quoting from the commission when I say that. That's how they described it in, you know, in 1939 when it was unveiled.
All right, thank you. This actually, there are several questions here that kind of touch on these same issues. Or pieces of it. We have a question, was TR's family consulted on the statue during its development? That's kind of part A. And I guess what Roosevelt family members were involved in the museum at that time when the statue was being developed?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know a lot about that. I do know that FDR, so we understand FDR, a relative, that FDR came to the dedication, as did Eleanor Roosevelt. I don't know who else they might have consulted with. That's a really interesting question, and I don't know the answer.
Okay, fair enough. Well, again, kind of on the same theme though, with the family, Aaron wants to know, what is the opinion of the current Roosevelt who is on the museum board about the controversy surrounding the statue?
Well, I can tell you he was very supportive of this project, of this initiative to reinterpret and recontextualize the statue. And I think that says a lot for him. He has been a museum supporter for many years, and we certainly wanted to think with him about this project. But he, among many others, would say, you know, TR wasn't perfect. And I think that's a big statement on behalf, and he has been nothing but supportive about this. Said he was happy to speak on behalf of it, in fact.
Excellent, thank you. Related, when the project was done, so that was what, the
2019, this one.
Okay. Was that done with private funds? I guess, how was the statue funded?
Yeah, it was certainly done with funds from a donor who has been long supportive of the museum. Okay. So it wasn't that we went out and fundraised specifically for this project, but there are funders who very much are part of our mission, part of our thinking all the time, and very eager to help the museum think hard and to push hard into some of this territory.
All right. Just to clarify, was when the statue was initially constructed or created, was that done with, how was that funded back in the?
That I think was part of the New York State Commission funds. I've never looked into that. I don't know where those funds came from, but
Okay.
the cost of the statue and the murals and the exhibit and the whole building was part of the New York State Roosevelt Commission. Can only imagine they did some fundraising on their own. So that would be really interesting to know.
All right. Patricia wants to know, are there any other statues with TR that have generated a similar controversy?
Oh, I don't know that. We probably have more people listening in who would know more about that than I do. I have to say that I think if this statue did not have the two figures below it, I don't think it would be especially controversial. Yes, there are people who have objected to TR as TR, but nobody objects to TR as a naturalist. And I think that it gets very tangled up here because of these two other figures. I don't think that most of the protests on the front steps would be happening around a statue of Theodore Roosevelt. They happen around this statue of these three people. And I'd be curious to hear, but I would find it hard to imagine that there are a lot of other statues of Theodore Roosevelt that are especially controversial.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say that I am aware of any. If anybody who is on the call who's aware of them, please type it into the chat. We'd love to love to know.
Mount Rushmore has its own controversies, of course, but I don't think that's about Roosevelt. I think that's about carving into the hills.
I think, yeah. Let's see. The other question we have, if it was decided to take the statue down, what do you think would happen to it?
Well, it's funny. There have been people who said, you should take the statue down and put it somewhere in the museum. I'm not sure these people have looked at how large the statue is. And also, I think, our project is to acknowledge that the statue is problematic. There have been people who said, there are many people who talk about this. There are people who've said, statues should be removed. Other statues should also be removed. They should all be put in some place. No one's very specific about what that place would be. But there are people certainly who have thought about this. And of course, if you think this statue is tall, that statue of Christopher Columbus in Columbus Circle is a whole lot taller than this one. It is difficult to know what to do with statues over time that come to be seen in a new light, or that maybe were, I'm thinking more of the Confederate statues. Those statues always had an agenda. The agenda was clear from the moment they were put up, because they weren't put up after the Civil War. They were put up in the 20s and 30s. They were put up at a specific moment for specific reasons. And I really don't know what you do with those statues. I worked on another project. I worked on the Mashantucket Pequot Museum, which is in Eastern Connecticut. And there was a statue in the town of Mystic it was an apocryphal statue of a 17th century man named John Mason. And Mason had led the charge that was a massacre of the Pequots in 1637. And the statue had gone up in the, probably the late 1800s. No one knew what John Mason looked like. And it was, a statue that the Native people found very offensive. And we proposed actually that when we were working on the museum, that we would like to have that statue and to take it off its very tall pedestal, to kind of bring it down to size, put it in our museum, and to interpret both why it went up and why it had been taken down. Because it only came down as the Pequots built a casino and became a very powerful tribe in the region and had the political clout to be heard that it should be taken down. They had wanted it taken down for decades, but nobody would listen to them until they had a lot more clout. So we really wanted it in our museum. We were outvoted, and it went off to a different location. It got out of Mystic, and it is still on view somewhere else in Connecticut.
All right. Actually, I'm reading in the chat. This was to panelists, but hopefully, if you visit the virtual tour of TR's birthplace, which is another national park site dedicated to TR, www.nps.gov/THRB, one can see a statue of TR on a horse similar to AMNH, but without the two other figures. So
good decision.
Kind of.
I'm glad somebody else got that right somewhere.
It's good to know. I wasn't aware of that. I'm going to have to check out that virtual tour. All right, so that's all the questions that have showed up in our Q&A. If anyone has any last-minute questions, please type them in. We'll wait a couple more minutes, but this has been really interesting, Lauri, and I really appreciate you giving us some insight into this exhibit and this initiative that the Museum of Natural History has been working on for the past couple of years.
You know, this kind of work it's difficult. It's difficult for museums to acknowledge that something that we've stood behind for many decades maybe wasn't what we always intended it to be, or that we need to say we were part of the problem. This is a hard thing, and I will tell you that agreeing that we would have to say difficult things about Theodore Roosevelt was not easy for our museum. I mean, TR really has been long understood to be our conservation hero. And I think one of our experts said it best of like, we should continue to applaud TR for his conservation work. And we should also acknowledge his race politics. Like, it doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be both, but it's difficult to say these difficult things. On the other hand, I would say that when we do, I think the public these days is much more interested in more honesty and transparency from organizations like all of ours. And I think it's a different time than it was when statues like this went up. It seems important now to try to be more honest. So we'll continue to do this kind of work. We are still very much engaged in our Northwest Coast Native Hall, and we have many other cultural halls that will still lie ahead. So plenty of work for us if we could just get back in the building.
All right. While you were chatting, we have one more question, and the question is, do you wish the statue wasn't there? In parentheses, it says serious question.
Well, I can really only answer that personally, not institutionally.
I think that's, yeah.
Yeah, personally, I don't love the statue. I think that when I understand that it's really hurtful to people, that it's not a good thing. We don't intend to be hurting people. That wasn't ever what any of us working in the museum world would want. And I think when we think of kids coming in the front door and they look at this, we don't want this to communicate a message that is not a message the museum wants to put out about racial hierarchy. So if it were up to me, I'd be happy to have TR on his horse. But this is not a statue I think personally I want on the front steps of the museum.
I think that's fair, and we appreciate your perspective on that, and realize that it is your personal perspective rather than an institutional one. Let's see, we have one more. Another question has popped up, and I'm just going to, let's see. I'm just going to read this one out. The more I look at the statue and the picture on the slide, the more I see TR is fighting with and for the other two people against the onslaught of exploitation that he knew was coming and wanted to stop with his conservation work. Did that thought ever come up?
Well, all thoughts had come up, I guess it's fair to say, but I don't see personally, I don't see the evidence of that in TR's writings. His writings about African people in African game trails, I don't see that. You know, he had some people would argue that TR was advanced in his thinking for his time, but you know, well before his time, we had Franz Boas in our museum arguing for cultural relativism, the idea that all cultures need to be understood on their own merits, and we should not be comparing one culture to another or understanding that some cultures are more sophisticated or more civilized. I don't see that in TR's writing about African peoples. It's just not how he seems to have seen them. And on Native peoples, I think TR did a lot of good work on conservation lands, but I think it's true that some conservation lands, not only did they displace Native peoples, but you know, there are historians who are greater experts about this than I, who would argue that some of the reason that some of these lands were made conservation lands was to displace Native peoples. It was a very difficult time, and TR, certainly having lived in the Dakotas, had seen a lot of the country out, not from the perspective of New York City, but from the perspective of what it was like to be in the Dakotas at that moment in time. It was a very difficult period in American history for Native peoples, certainly, and for colonists as well in their own way. So I'd like to believe that, and I'd be curious to hear more. There are many of you on this call are much greater TR scholars than I am. I'd be curious if others share that thought. I don't see it myself.
All right, thank you. We are going to wrap up in just a minute, but I happen to see that our director has somehow has raised his hand, so I'm just going to let Stanton Hudson, the TR Site director, to talk for a minute and give him the floor.
Well, my hand went down when I realized that I had inadvertently done that, but
oh, oops.
But that's all right. Lauri, this was fascinating, and thank you for allowing us to use you as a guinea pig this evening for this first ever type of presentation. I think it was terrific. I was fascinated. You did an excellent job. I obviously must realize you've done this before. It was terrific, and I hope that those of you who've joined us tonight found it just as informative and just as enlightening as I did. So thank you, Lauri, once again for being with us this evening.
You're very welcome. Happy to be your guinea pig.
All right, so I don't see any other questions, so I think we will wrap up. And thank you again, Lauri. Thank you for everyone who joined us on this call. And I guess we will close.
Thanks so much.
All right, bye everyone. Good night.
Good night, Lenora.